recently, European Cantors Association, Jewish Music Forum, and the UCLA Center for the Study of Religion. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Yair Lipshitz. Yair Lipshitz is a senior lecturer at the Department of Theater Arts and head of the Symbolista Jewish Heritage Center at Tel Aviv University. Yair's research examines the various intersections between theater performance and Jewish religious tradition. He is the author of the Holy Tongue comedy version, intertextual dramas on the stage of a comedy of betrothal, embodied tradition, theatrical performances of Jewish texts, these are both in Hebrew, and Theater and Judaism that was published in 2019. He has also published numerous papers dealing with topics ranging from Jewish Italian theater in the Renaissance to the queering of scripture in Angels in America, and from Jewish ritual and performance theory to the reception of King Lear and Salome in modern Hebrew culture. His current project focuses on rabbinic literature in performance. Yair, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Ruthie, and thank you, Mark, both for inviting me to this wonderful series of talks and events. And I was much enriched by earlier discussions, and I'm looking forward to where this might lead. Let me share my screen. Okay, do you see it? All is well? Cool. Okay. So in this presentation, I wish to consider Kol Nidre from a performative viewpoint and examine it as some kind of prologue, an entryway into the rest of the Yom Kippur service. As performance, I will explore Kol Nidre's dramaturgy, the interrelations between text, staging, speech, and action, and set it vis-a-vis the overall dramaturgy of Yom Kippur that is to follow. My main argument here is that there is a cluster of performative tensions within Kol Nidre and between Kol Nidre and other rituals that complicates its role as prologue within the liturgy as a whole. At the service, Kol Nidre presents itself as a performance of an annulment of vows. However, as I am hardly the first to note, this is far from being a simple statement. In fact, there is another authoritative process in Jewish tradition for the annulment of vows, Hatarat Nedarim, that is performed quite differently. Hatarat Nedarim is conducted whenever one requires to do so, but also regularly prior to Rosh Hashanah, and some also conducted prior to Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre notwithstanding. Most commonly, Hatarat Nedarim is performed by an individual standing in front of 3 people. Here you have, this is an early picture of a person standing in front of 10 people, but usually it's 3 people, which is the convocation of the court or the Beit Din. And this person conducts a dialogue with them. It can also be conducted in front of one individual expert, but this is rarely the case. The ceremony begins with a long monologue by the person asking to annul the vows, starting with the words, Shim'una Rabotai Dayanim Mumchim, please listen to me, gentlemen, expert judges, followed by a long statement in Hebrew that resembles the Aramaic text of Kol Nidre, Kol Neder o Shvu'ah o Isar o Konam o Cherem, Shenadarti o Shenishbati. These are precisely the same words in Hebrew that we find in Kol Nidre. However, in Hatarat Nedarim, we have a far more detailed description than in Kol Nidre, and the person also expresses regrets, asks the Bet Din to annul the vows. The entire monologue is replete with direct addresses to the Beit Din, such as, and here are some examples, ושואל ומבקש אני ממעלתכם התרה עליהם, and I ask and request from your honors to annul them. אך דעונה רבותיי, please know, gentlemen, על כן יהיו בעיניכם כאילו הייתי פורתם, therefore may you please consider them, the vows, as if I have detailed them. So I have all these direct references to the audience, to the person that he's talking to. This speech is followed by a reply by the Beit Din, who repeats 3 times that all the vows are annulled and forgiven in the earthly court and hopefully in the heavenly court above as well. And I'm showing this not just so we'll have the exact text, but as you can see that the dialogic nature of Atarat Nedarim, each paragraph here is spoken first. The first one is spoken by the person annulling the vows, then the court, then the person again, and then the court. So we have a back and forth dialogue that continues with yet another statement by the person beseeching the annulment, in which he or she states that all future vows are to be void as well. Despite several linguistic resemblances that tie Kol Nidre to Hatarat Nedarim, their performative dynamics are profoundly different. Indeed, some halachic authorities throughout Jewish history doubted the efficacy of Kol Nidre as an annulment of vows, while the Hatarat Nedarim ceremony is unequivocally considered the halachic, efficacious manner of going through the process. 12th century French halachic authority and Rashi's grandson, Rabbeinu Tam, gave 4 reasons for the invalidity of Kol Nidre as an annulment of vows. These are, number 1, that in an annulment of vows, in Hatarat Nedarim, one has to express regret from the start, and Kol Nidre does not begin with the expression of regret. 2, for the annulment of vows, one needs an expert individual or a trio of lay people, and these are absent in Kol Nidre. 3, in an annulment of vows, one has to detail the vow, and this is not done in Kol Nidre. And 4, one cannot annul one's own vows. And this is according to Rabbeinu Tam, as he's quoted in Tosfot in the Babylonian Talmud, Nedarim 23. What I would like to focus on here are reasons number 2 and 4. Rabbeinu Tam notes the lack of an authority, either an expert or a forum, that can legally annul the vows. But what also emerges from his concern is that the performance of Kol Nidre is not dialogic. As opposed to Hatarat Nedarim, Kol Nidre is both written and performed as a collective monologue. And as Rabbeinu Tam states, one cannot annul one's own vows. The annulment has to come from someone else. What Kol Nidre lacks is a presence of an other. Some have tried to solve this problem, such as 15th century Austrian rabbi Isaac Tirnau, who writes in his book Sefer HaMinhagim, and the reason for the custom that the congregation says Kol Nidre quietly with the Shaliach Tzibur, with the Chazan, is to annul the Shaliach Tzibur's vows, for he cannot annul it to himself. Tirnau tries to turn the performance into a dialogical one. The murmuring congregation actually annuls the Chazan's vows, while the Chazan annuls theirs. This attempt, however, only further accentuates the fact that the entirety of the community murmurs the text together with the Chazan, and all of them do it in plural first person. Even more intriguingly, there is no specified addressee in the text. No expert judges of the Beit Din are mentioned, as in Hatarat Nedarim. In terms of the mise en scène, and it's quite rare to find a photo of an Orthodox Kol Nidre for obvious reasons, but here's one from the internet. In terms of mise en scène, while there is perhaps a hint of the 3 members of the Beit Din in the Chazan, who is flanked by 2 members of the congregation, all 3 holding Torah scrolls, it is important to note that these 3 do not exactly serve as a Beit Din, nor do they stand facing the congregation as a Beit Din should, at least not in Orthodox synagogues. Rather, they are part of the congregation annulling its own vows. The stress here is on communality, strengthened by the inclusive opening statement of permitting to pray with their transgressors. Instead of some exterior authority absolving their vows, the congregation does it itself. In spatial terms, instead of facing a Beit Din, the entire community, including its 3 leaders, is facing something else altogether: the open Holy Ark, Aron HaKodesh. Arguably, this would seem to imply that the addressee of Kol Nidre is God, made present in, through, or beyond the Holy Ark. The lack of a human Beit Din opens up the moment to the presence of the transcendent, who is supposed to absolve the vows. This allows for the spiritual and emotional heights of Kol Nidre, as discussed in our previous sessions, especially regarding music. Indeed, such heights would probably seem out of place in some interhuman legalistic court procedure. This is also implied in the 13th century Machzor Vitri, which describes the thrice repeated vocal performance of Kol Nidre, and imagines the ceremony as one of an encounter with God and speech to him. And I quote, Yom Kippur's Eve, at Ma'ariv, one will cover oneself with one's talit, without a benediction, and say in a low voice, Nidre Nidrana, which is Kol Nidre. The first time, one will speak in a very low voice, as a person who is bewildered to enter the king's palace and ask a reward from the king and is afraid to draw near and speaks quietly as if threatened. On the second time, one will raise one's voice a little more than at the first time, and likewise, on the third time, one will raise one's voice even more and more as a person who is part of the household, who grew accustomed to be of the king's household, and his heart is crass or regular with the king when he draws near, and his heart is ready to hear his words. All these translations are my own, so apologies if they are not the best. The Hebrew of the final statement is ambiguous. Whose heart is ready to hear whose words? Is God's heart ready to hear the praying person's words, or is the praying person's heart open to hear God's? This way or that, and perhaps even more strongly because of this ambiguity, it is clear that the final intended outcome of Kol Nidre, according to Mahzor Vitri, is a full conversation between God and the praying person. This fits well with the rest of the Yom Kippur service, which constantly and intimately addresses God in the second person. The spatial imagery of entering the palace also echoes the spatial dynamics of the temple ritual of Yom Kippur, retold and in some communities even reenacted to a degree in what is called Seder HaAvodah at the Musaf service, the gradual and dangerous entrance of the high priest into the Holy of Holies in the temple. Both in the ancient temple ritual and in the rest of the contemporary Yom Kippur liturgy, the focal point of a divine other is clear and fundamental. However, in the text of Kol Nidre, God is barely mentioned, and when it is mentioned, it is only in the ceremony's periphery and only in the third person. At first, God is mentioned as Hamakom, the place that gives permission to pray with the transgressors, and again at the end of Kol Nidre, in the concluding verse from Numbers 14:20, and God said, I have forgiven as you said. In other words, Kol Nidre speaks of God, but not to God, and even that only at a bare minimum. One may argue convincingly that what is lacking in the text is filled by performance. The mise-en-scène of the entire congregation facing the open Holy Ark, a special remnant of the Holy of Holies in the synagogue's architecture, bestows upon the moment, together with the musicality, a sense of a transcendent presence that the text, with its roots still in the interhuman Hatarat Nedarim, does not. However, even the performance of Kol Nidre complicates this, through the custom of taking out the Torah scrolls from the Holy Ark and carrying them during the entire ceremony. The number of Torah scrolls taken out varies according to different sources. It could be 1, 2, 3, 7, or all the scrolls, leaving the Ark entirely empty. And some sources don't mention the exact number at all, so it's unclear. As almost any other element in Kol Nidre, the reasons and roots for this custom are unclear and open for interpretation. I would like to focus here on one explanation given by Rabbi Betzalel Ashkenazi from 16th century Jerusalem in his book Shita Mekubetzet. And I'm reading in translation. And in Spain, there was a custom that the Shaliach Tzibur holds the Torah scroll in his bosom and says Kol Nidre loudly, and the whole congregation says it with him. And the reason for this is so that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, will be in agreement with them in annulment. And the Hebrew is Ve'atam kedei sheyeh Shekhinah maskemet imahem b'hatara. I find this to be a particularly compelling interpretation because it follows a performative logic in Jewish tradition that understands the Torah scrolls or the Ark as a material manifestation or sign of the presence of God within the community. And there are many examples for that. In this case, according to the Shita Mekubetzet, the physical presence of the Torah scrolls amidst the praying community manifests God's presence within, joining them in the annulment. What this would mean, though, is that again, God is not outside of the procedure, but part of it. As the Torah scrolls are hugged by the congregation members in the crowd. While it clearly has authority, implied by the need for the Shekhinah's agreement to the annulment, its exterior position is undermined. It is striking that in the Hebrew that we see here, Ashkenazi writes that the Shekhinah agrees with them, muskemet imahem. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with them and not outside of them, granting its authority. This is where that. The performance of Kol Nidre therefore dialectically fluctuates between opening up and folding in. It negates the exterior presence of a human Beit Din in favor of an inner communal monologue, which would seem to open up to another exterior presence, that of God, only to fold in again and draw the divine presence itself into the communal performance. All this in stark contrast to what is to follow in the performance of the Yom Kippur liturgy, in which an exterior divine other is a clear focal point. As prologue, Kol Nidre creates a liminal moment which blurs the line between self and other, human community, and the divine. Thus, it serves as an entryway into the rest of the day in which the boundaries between these are actually more clearly demarcated. On another level, but by these dynamics of opening up and folding in, Kol Nidre establishes the space of the synagogue as the site where it all happens. As opposed to the rest of the liturgy, there is no implied exteriority, or perhaps exteriority itself is internalized. And whatever will happen from now on will happen here, with those present. Kol Nidre sets the stage for the synagogue itself to become the stage. And through it, the community produces itself with the consent of God, hamakom, literally the place, and with the consent of the congregation, in the convocation of the whole heavenly court, and in the convocation of the earthly court, al dat hamakom ועל דעת הקהל, בישיבה של מעלה ובישיבה של מטה. Thank you.
Thank you, Yair. And we will move straight on to our next speaker, Elazar Ben-Lulu. Elazar Ben-Lulu is an anthropologist of religion and gender with particular interest in the intersection of LGBTQ+ identities and Judaism. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Herbert Katz Center for the Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and at the Israeli Center for Israel Studies at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel in Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. His work on Jewish LGBTQ life cycle ritual won an HBI Research Award to 2021 on behalf of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. He also won the Baron New Voices in Jewish Studies Award for 2019 and 2020, a prize granted by the Institute for Israel and Judaic Studies, Columbia University, and Fordham University. Dr. Ben-Lulu's work was published at Contemporary Jewry, Journal of Homosexuality, Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, etc. His last publication, Zooming in and out of virtual Jewish prayer services during the COVID-19 pandemic, is available at Journal for Scientific Study of Religion. Dr. Ben-Lulu also works as a journalist and has a podcast on Israel, social and cultural matters in the public radio station Galei Tzahal. Elazar, it's a pleasure to host you here tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ruti. Thanks, Mark. And thank you so much, Yair. It was super interesting. My lecture is a little bit different because it's focused on one voice of one congregant in Halev congregation. It's based on my dissertation, my field work between 2016 and 2017. My ethnographic research was conducted here in Tel Aviv in two different congregations. Every congregation invited me to think about different trajectories and intersection between gender, sexuality, and religion. I'm interested in the questions of how LGBTQ people and women experience the ritual, especially in Reform congregation as a non-Orthodox congregation, which allow and encourage in sexual and gender discourse in the synagogue, and not only on Me Too campaign on Facebook and other public sites. I would like to start with Igal. Igal is one of the congregants in the Halev congregation, and I got interview with him some month after Yom Kippur and asked him about his experience at Halev congregation. I recited Al Chet and remember all those childhood moments when all I wanted to be is someone else. I begged God to make me straight. It's true. That's the prayer doesn't deal with sexual identity at all, but I felt that it all begins and ends in my gay sin. And it's even more powerful that you pray in a Reform community that is perceived as a sinner in Israel. My friends told me, why are you going to a Reform community? It's Yom Kippur. Halev congregation was established 10 years ago in the center of Tel Aviv. It's really interesting to think about this, that the first establishment steps of the congregation, because unlike other congregation, unlike other Reform and Masorti conservative congregation in Israel, this congregation was born by the citizens. I mean, some couples, a group of people who lived in the center of Tel Aviv looked for a spiritual egalitarian community, and they contact with the Reform movement here in Israel, and that's the result, a community which come by people's willings and people's passions to look for different religious experiences, not the Orthodox experiences, not the Orthodox practice, which is the hegemonic and the consensus among the Israeli people. Rabbi Efrat Rotem, she was led the ceremonies. She was the rabbi in the fieldwork term, and the congregation allowed and created different kinds of rituals, especially for LGBTQ community. The community found the LGBTQ community in Tel Aviv as an alternative and attractive community to negotiate with and to think together how to make the congregation as a safe space for LGBTQ community. As a result, some of the congregants are LGBTQ people. The congregation is not defined itself as a queer or gay synagogue. It's not informal, but it's not the formal definition of the congregation. But once the rabbi, she is a butch lesbian rabbi, and some of the rituals are dedicated to LGBTQ community. For example, every November, I think it's the next week, the International Memorial Day for Trans people. So the congregation create and conduct a special Shabbat service for trans victims. So here you can see Pride Shabbat Ga'ava, every year in June. The congregation celebrates Shabbat Ga'ava. But once we think about the Reform congregation in Israel and the intersection with the LGBTQ community, and how the Reform Israeli movement identify the LGBTQ community as part of the as a partner, it's not only a political mission. It's not only a political understanding of the delegitimation and the lack of recognition by the Israeli government or by the Israeli company. It's theological, of course. It's theological background, the theological background and the theological and the ideology of the Reform movement as liberal movement is to include women and LGBTQ people to the community. But it was a process, and once it was a process, we think we should need to come back to New York, because once I, but now it's you, because we're together in this same lecture. Once we think about how Reform community works in Israel, we should understand what's going on in the state and what was happened in the state since the 70s, when the reform movement established as the first and the pioneer religious community, which included LGBTQ people. First, it was homosexual men, and then lesbian, and in later on, only bisexual and trans people. Here, for example, some sources which I collected in American Jewish Archive, and it's nice opportunity to thank again to Rabbi Gary Zola and Dana Herman for the opportunity to spend 2 months as the archive and to found these materials. For example, surveys about AIDS and how the community created new rituals for people who suffer and dead because AIDS pandemic, and how they invite people with HIV to the community and to include their family and the people themselves to be part of the community, to share with the community about their situation, to bless, to pray together as a community. Here, for example, a Mishaberach, new Mishaberach for people with HIV. But come back to Israel. As I said before, Reform community in Israel are still the inner, the outsider, the stranger. People don't really know what does it mean to be an Israeli Reform congregant in Israel. Even the Reform congregants themselves, when I ask people, how do you define your Jewish identity as someone who come to Reform community? Some people don't define themselves as an Israeli Jewish Reform. I mean, they use in different terms, but they don't feel comfortable. Some of them don't feel comfortable with the Reform because they know that Reform is something complicated to understanding in the Israeli society, and Reform communities still fight against the Orthodox consciousness and discrimination by the Israeli government. In this way, the LGBTQ community as well as a marginal group fight against LGBTQ-phobic responses and LGBTQ-phobic laws and rules. For example, no surrogacy in Israel for a gay couple or for a single gay man. There is no legal civic marriage for LGBTQ people. And it's interesting to think about the intersection, how two different groups, the LGBTQ community and the Reform community, found themselves fight against the Orthodox monopoly and the heteronormative, heterosexual Orthodox consciousness among the Israeli society, and of course against the government. When we think about Kol Nidre and the understanding how Reform community or Reform liturgy understand Kol Nidre and deal with this specific prayer, I found three categories to think about the combination between Reform liturgy, Reform theology, and this specific prayer. The first category is the open dialogue with the text, the Talmud, the divinity's positionality and existence, and the social interaction with other. Every category is integral part of the typology of Kol Nidre and how Kol Nidre was established as a spiritual religious performance and become really common among different Jewish communities throughout the history. The positionality and the existence of the divinity, God, and what does it mean to stand in front of Melech Molchei Amlechim. And of course, the social interaction and how different local peoples understand these Jewish particular rituals, and how by the understanding of the ritual, the community and Jewish community reorganize, change, omit, abolish some parts of the liturgy. So first, once we think about the text itself and before we think about the connection between text and context and context and how the performance include these criteria, the Talmud is inspiration among Reform community. And the Talmud, it's not an authority. It's something really open. It's an open text that different rabbis, Reform rabbis, in different times, always deal open discussion and open dialogue with the text, with the Talmud. And that's allow for some rabbis to find the Kol Nidre sometimes as a really spiritual performance, and it's not come with the modern values of Reform theology and with Reform liturgy. And the first sidurs, the first prayer books, we can't find Kol Nidre in the first prayer book. But today, the prayer it's here. And this, for example, from Ha'avodah Balev, the first Hebrew sidur for Reform congregation, we can find different construction of the prayer. Some were translated, some versions were translated by the English version, but some are created by Israeli rabbis and Israeli rabbis and American rabbis as well. Or for example, once gender equality is a sacred value, it's a holy value among Reform and non-Orthodox community. Instead of, for example, a melech, we can say Shechina makor chayenu, and how feminine divinity, and to include this Kabbalistic term to the Reform Sidur. I mean, it sounds really awkward how Reform Sidur can take some spiritual and Kabbalistic liturgical terms, but it's happened. And it's interesting to think how the Shechina is in the text. The second category, as I said before, the faith. I mean, once the worshiper stand in front of the Siddur, where is God is a question. And if I pray and who is the forgiver for my blessing, for my moment of prayer, the practice is the worshiper and God created different dynamic interactions once the Kol Nidre happen. And the faith issue, and what does it mean? Where is God in the text, or where is God in the theology and the dynamic in the performance moment? It's open question. It's open matter among Reform community and Reform people who ask for God and sometimes switch God by maybe man or woman, or think about God by different categories instead of to sanctify God as something something acceptable, for example. And I found it really interesting to think about is once we think about Yom Kippur and all the meaning of Kol Nidre and the moment that we stand in front of someone who will give us the opportunity to start from the beginning. I will continue because I want to share with you some of the description. And of course, the last question is, who is the other? And once we define the other as the other, we define ourselves as a self. I mean, the dynamic between Jewish community and the general population, the general society, it's essential. It's the DNA of what does it mean with Reform liturgy and Reform community. And the boundaries and the borders between the foreign and the Jew, between the foreign and the other, it's something that Reform community always deal with. And in this case of Kol Nidre, it's opportunity to think how it's come together as well, because Kol Nidre was a response for, I mean, because different people understood Kol Nidre as by different interpretation, and sometimes they don't really understand what does it mean. Sometimes it causes crisis between between the Jewish community and the local general community, or an unauthentic show. I mean, the minority and the majority, and if the Jewish community is a minority and as a marginal group, always the meaning of someone believe me and give me the opportunity to be part of the general society and to recognize me as an other, it's something that's really important when we think about interactions and networks between Jewish community and the general foreign community. Come back again to Yigal, and let's think about the text and the performance now when we think about the typology and how the typology find the field. I felt part of a community, part of a Jewish tradition. I participated with two friends of mine, and I felt connected to the prayer. I always feel so uncomfortable at Kol Nidre, and now I felt empowered, but I can't remember how I played with God to make me straight. It's true that prayer is not about sexual identity at all, but I felt that everything somehow connected to my sin of homosexuality. Every time in Ashamnu, I was so sad about my life, and the prayer affirmed it. It is like the confession that someone goes to church and confess in front of the pastor. We have no pastor. You pray and confess in front of yourself. On Yom Kippur in the Halef community, I felt different. Suddenly, I said to myself, look, what's going on here? A lesbian rabbi is leading the prayer. Everyone knows about your gay identity and they are okay with that. And some of your faults are gay also. It's not a common view, especially in an Israeli synagogue. The Ashamnu punch directed to the chest become a punch of strength and victory. Sorry, sound kitschy, but it's true. In general, during the whole prayer, I remember that I felt uncomfortable with my body. I kind of apologized for waiting to do other things with my body. I told yourself, what's wrong with your body? What kind of man am I? So as we understand by exposed to this description of Yigal, how the prayer become part of the sexual and homosexual recognition, how the moment and the context of Yom Kippur and Kol Nidre, the vows and the sin become part not only of the national historical narrative, but it's a part of his daily life of recognition or life of lack of recognition. So he felt time after time uncomfortable with the other synagogue. I mean, in Orthodox synagogue, when there is no gay rabbi and the atmosphere is different. One sentence before, I forgot to say, the prayer and a Lev congregation the prayer was not conducted in a synagogue. I think most of the Reform communities in Israel, they don't pray, they don't conduct their prayers and practices at a synagogue, but they rent a building or a space, an audium, or maybe a classroom at a school, and conduct the prayer in this area, in this space. So it's interesting to think about the moment that someone pray not in a synagogue, because the space and the worship space, it's not an instrumental category, it's part of the performance, and it's design and construct new interpretations and point of view regarding what does it mean holiness, sacredness, and what does it mean tradition once I pray in, I don't know, in the middle of a school. So once he, yes, as he described, he was surrounded by friends, gay people, and they pray together with a lesbian queer rabbi, establish his experience and invite him to think about what does it mean, how how was his childhood, and he remembered about different difficult times of closet. And as Judy Butler invited us to think about the gender melancholy and how the closet and the secret cause to LGBTQ people very, very difficult life, because they feel guilt and shame with their body, with their sexuality. And the confession and the meaning of confession, not only in vidui, in alchet, when someone take his hand and pray, and his body, in this case, become an agent, a social agent of inclusion more than exclusion. But the confession, the confession makes, or his confessions, it's not about his sexual sins, homosexual sins. It's different confession. It's different confession, and the text of Kol Nidre and the moment of Yom Kippur allowed him to think differently about what does it mean to confess, and in front of who? In front of yourself, in front of God. But not only a text, but also a time. And this specific ritual was in 2016. And in 2016, the same day of Yom Kippurim, it was the coming out day, the national coming out day. And he said, later when I arrived home, I saw on Facebook that a friend shared a post by Iggy, the Israeli gay youth movement, that reads, "Today is the national coming out day. Be free, the world is open." Yeah, could it be more ironic that it actually happened on Yom Kippur? Suddenly, the prayer flooded my mind, thoughts, memories, everything connected. I decided to write a post. I wrote one sentence that I remember. It was a sentence that I paraphrased from a song that we used to sing in my IDF unit. I changed some of the words and signed, "Come out of the closet." One of my friends from the army, from the army time, liked the post. I'm not sure he understood what I meant, but it's not matter. In our time, like is everything. So in this case, it's not only the text, and it's not only the space, the time. And the time of Kol Nidre, and the time, the specific time, specific day that promote and advance LGBTQ people to come out of the closet, to share with their memories, to fight against LGBTQ phobia by sharing at the moment of a prayer, or at by writing and publishing a post by Facebook. It's interesting to think about the double meaning of time in this case, and how the prayer cross the moment of the prayer. I mean, Kol Nidre and the meaning of a confession, the meaning of to tell true, or to feel to renew the connection between you and your body, it come with different interpretation when we think about the meaning of time, and how the day specifically come with the space and with the text, and create a liminal moment that allow him to develop, to create new thought regarding his sexuality, and how the performance, it's not only limited by time and space, but it could happen also at home. I mean, the moment of the performance was done when the ritual was done, and then he went home, and something happened after the ritual. I would like to summarize, because I want to be on time. So as I try to argue, and I know that it's only one case, I know it's really micro and it's really one voice, but this specific and this particular experience of Yigal, I guess that it's not only his personal experience, it's more social and political experiences of more LGBTQ people and other non-binary people who felt comfortable at non-Orthodox religious denominations, such as the Reform or Conservative movement, and Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur with the religious, spiritual, and political meaning. And who is the other? Who is I am? And what does it mean to feel foreign? And what does it mean to me to be a minority? It's an opportunity. It's liminal time. It's in a twilight zone, which allow LGBTQ people who live in the twilight zone, who live always with these reflexive questions and issues regarding faith, regarding truth, regarding a community and the meaning of a community. In this case, I guess it's not only a micro or a specific case, but it could be illuminates on other people and other communities abroad. So once other and previous scholars talk about distinction of Kol Nidre and how Kol Nidre was a moment of separation, in this case, we can see how it's a moment of connection and intersection between two different communities, LGBTQ community and the Reform community in the case of Israel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elazar. I'm inviting everyone to have a look at the chat. There's quite an interesting discussion going on there. We will move now to our discussant. Professor Laura Lieber is Professor of Religious Studies and Classical Studies at Duke University, where she also directs the Center for Jewish Study. A scholar of liturgical poetry in late antiquity, Lieber received her BA in English and Classics from the University of Arkansas, her rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and her PhD from the University of Chicago. Before joining the Duke faculty, she was an assistant professor of religion and classics at Middlebury College in Vermont. Professor Lieber is the author of many books. Her book, Staging the Sacred, Performance in Late Ancient Liturgical Poetry, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press, but she's also the author of Yanai on Genesis, An Invitation to Piyut, from the Hebrew Union College Press in 2010, A Vocabulary of Desire, The Song of Songs in Early Synagogue by Brill, 2014, Jewish Aramaic Poetry from Late Antiquity, also by Brill in 2018, and Classical Samaritan Poetry by Penn State University Press, 2021, sorry. Laura, thank you so much for being with us tonight. The floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, both to participate in this and for assembling two papers that I think work so beautifully together to illustrate the dynamic nature of studying liturgy writ large, as well as specifically the prayer Kol Nidre. And I think Kol Nidre has worked beautifully through all of these sessions as sort of a laboratory for helping everyone appreciate the richness of liturgy as a field of study, and for helping us decouple in a way, or sort of understand the way that the written words, which in many ways are the most accessible part of the liturgical tradition in Judaism, especially when you're in the pre-modern period, that those words are really just the first level of material that it's like a tracing of an echo of what the actual experience was like, to sort of to sort of have a little bit of synesthesia there. I think that today's papers work together beautifully to illustrate the importance of recognizing the lived experiences of those who participated in the services, whether they were, as the cantor at the front of the congregation, or any of the participants who were there, and recognizing how fluid and dynamic it was, whether people were trying to sort of fit their understanding of the halakha to the rituals that they regarded as sort of sacred inheritance, which I think we saw in Yair's paper, the way sort of that the ritual tends to pre-exist from any sort of explanations of exactly how it came to be. You know, we don't have the minutes of the meetings where people decided to have certain practices take place. And so instead you have sometimes what appears to be sort of a misalignment between sacred practices and theory, which the halachic authorities were trying to sort of reconcile in a way that made both seem sort of whole and appropriate and respected. And we even see the fluidity in Yigal's case that Elazar presented of how one individual over the course of just several years can have his own experience of the same text and the same music change simply because the framing changed. And I think if we multiply sort of the number of people in a congregation and the number of factors that we really can so easily take for granted and not think through in terms of understanding sort of what the liturgical experience is, that we often can overlook sort of some of the most powerful elements, whether it's the ambiance or the music, the physical presence of friends and loved ones or the absence of friends and loved ones, sort of a sense of belonging or a sense of alienation, a sense of harmony or a sense of something being out of whack. You know, that I think all of those sorts, you know, the way that the, you know, those who are assembling or sort of orchestrating the prayers, you know, whether it's the tone that the rabbi or the cantor is trying to set, that those are also to sort of establish a way of experiencing the prayer. We can talk to contemporary rabbis and cantors about the ways they attempt to do these things. And I'm quite certain that in antiquity, you know, the people, and in the Middle Ages, that people also wanted certain, you know, certain experience. I think sometimes in various periods, the larger social forces do a lot of that, could have done a lot of that work in terms of sort of like the sacred calendar and not having to think so much about things. I think nowadays, because of all the different options that people have and the different sort of pushes and pulls that that sort of takes some more self-conscious thinking sometimes to, you know, you have more options about how you want people to experience things. But there's still always those elements, I think, of the orchestration and the dramaturgy. One of the things I think today's papers also did a beautiful job of highlighting is that the tension between sort of what is old and what is new. And I think you can see this in the way, you know, as Elazar pointed out, that the Reform movement looks back to the Talmud, or the way that you see in a lot of the new prayer books that have come out, whether it's in the prayer texts themselves or in sort of sidebars and alternatives, that often the alternatives to a traditional prayer, you know, what's sort of perceived as a traditional prayer, is often another text also from antiquity. So there's this sort of mining the tradition for sort of authoritative, authenticated words, which may in some way be an alternative to the received sort of canonical text, if we want to think of it that way. At the same time, we also have innovators, as Elazar pointed out. You have new sort of Kol Nidre prayers being written at various points. And that's sort of what we think of as creative liturgy itself harkens back to the material that I study from late antiquity of the Piyutim, where you had new prayers every single week and you had the dynamics between the calendar and the poet. And part of what attracted people to the synagogue was not the fixed words, but their ability to participate in this sort of this new creation on a regular basis. So in a way, the freezing of the liturgy, which I think in a lot of ways, and certainly Pedakowski, who was mentioned in the chat, would have recognized, was, you know, the printing press in a way sort of standardized things in a way that was itself a kind of novelty in the Jewish tradition, and that now what we see with all the different versions, whether it's, you know, musical settings or words of Kol Nidre, that sort of that fluidity and ability of every congregation to personalize the Siddur, the Machzor itself, is in a way a very old practice in Judaism. I think just some of the things that have come out in both papers that are really worth thinking through is the one would be the issue of audience. I think that both Yair, in terms of the halachic, who can annul the vow, and Elazar, sort of more implicitly touched on, is that there are any numbers of audiences for a liturgical moment, especially one as charged as Kol Nidre. You have whether it's God, whether it's represented, God as represented by the open ark, or the sort of the revelation of the Torah scrolls that are being sort of brought there in the Torah scrolls, which represents sort of the meeting point of God and the congregation in many ways. You have the Yeshiva Shel Mala, the Academy on high, and the Yeshiva Shel Mata being invoked, the sort of the community below. You have the sort of ephemeral, I think, idea of sort of like, I am part of a collective Jewish people being invoked, but you also have the Jews in the room, who are sort of also the immediate community. And then I think, both in their thinking through the consequences of sort of the ritual aspects in Yair's case and the voice of Yigal and Elazar's, you have the self as an audience of these. There's a moment, really almost sort of like you might think of it, whether it's self-estrangement or self-affirmation or self-consciousness. I think that can be very different, but the self-consciousness, which we see, in a way is sort of understood in the halacha around the Shema, and that you have to say things loud enough that you yourself can hear them. And so there's sort of almost a distance, between, I guess, a sensory distance, so you are in a way understood to be your own audience in the halacha. So I think we have sort of this manifold number of audiences simultaneously, and I think it's like, the instant you stop to think about it too much, you sort of disturb the moment. So it's hard to study. I also think that both in terms of the attention to ritual and the attention to setting, that the spatiality and materiality of liturgy has been really highlighted in both of these papers. What can be seen? You have a different ambiance if you are in a school versus if you are in a synagogue. But that even if you're in a synagogue, it's not like there's a single cardboard copy synagogue architecture and mode of interior design. I think we have everything from very sort of very simple spaces to very ornate spaces, just any number of kinds of spaces. And often, especially in the US for the high holidays, you're in a different space from your regular space for the high holidays, and Kol Nidre especially, because that's often the most well-attended service. So that is the one holiday when many synagogues that might have a perfectly adequate space find themselves in a theater or some other non-conventionally sacred space for that service of all services. So, and I think in that sort of that self-awareness of space, whether it's in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, whether you're looking sort of at beautiful frescoes and mosaics and other things, or if you're in sort of a busy someplace that opens onto a busy street and you see the rest of the world passing you by as you're trying to separate yourself into a sanctuary of time. I think both of these papers touched on that. And the musicality, of course, of Kol Nidre, which has been important in this series, the acoustics of a space, and if the acoustics of a space work correctly, I mean, if they resonate in the proper way and sort of create it can be, whether it's a solemn or ethereal experience, back to that, the cantor, obviously has to sort of work with the space is one of the cantor's most important instruments. And we know from late antiquity that they were very conscious of this, and they used amphorae and other sorts of ways of improving the acoustics of performance spaces in churches and synagogues. And all the way to, I think, whether certain spaces like hot or cold. I think many of us have had the experience of being in a sanctuary and you're trying to be in the moment, but all you can think of is whether you're sweaty or freezing. And this is even touched on, the idea that you're through an act of imagination, the liturgical experience hopes that you will be able to transform whatever space you are in into sort of the outer realm of the divine chamber. And I think, so the focusing on the ark can often help with that, but even that depends on the nature of the ark. And many, like this year, if you're outside in a temporary space with a temporary ark, that ark probably was not as, it took more imagination maybe for people to find their way into that sacred space. And I do think that one thing that came out especially, in the thinking through the theory of Kol Nidre, is the way that it can be constructed almost as a sort of a bookend to Ne'ilah, the same sort of like standing before an open ark in that divine presence, only there you've been fasting for 25 hours, and it's perhaps a little easier to get into a more transcendent headspace at that point. I also just, in terms of Elazar's images, that the use of a rainbow flag for the parophets, over the ark, that itself, that's the kind of thing that can be so easily lost to time. If there weren't photographic images, the colors of the synagogue space, as well as all the visual cues of, the Torah being dressed in white, if that custom is observed, and all the other sort of cues to the nature of the space you are entering at that moment, in the way, because Kol Nidre, coming so close to the beginning of the service, and even, practices such as, wearing the talit at the service, and with all these sorts of things, which, it's almost like the beginning of the Seder, where it's designed to inspire questions and to make you feel a little bit wrong-footed in a way as you begin. I would just notice, in terms of the music, in addition to the music itself, I think the communality that both Yair and Elazar highlighted, the importance of the being with other people in that moment, and the nature of, whether it's the reciting, it's not just reciting the words, it's the music. And I think of Ambrose, the church father, who compared the combination of multiple voices to the strings of a harp, but that there's an awareness of being one among many. And I think also in that sense of where you stand in relationship, again, to those others, and how you understand the sort of the individual liturgical experience. At the same time, there is the Gestalt sort of complete experience as well. And I think, in the end, I just like to note that, in a way, the papers highlight sort of the tension between stability and instability in the liturgical experience. That there are certain things which are, received and preserved, and then there are others that are dynamic and fluid. Some things change because people desire change. Sometimes change happens more gradually and organically, and some people don't even sort of notice that change has happened. Whereas other times, such as like the Reformed Prayer Book, it's very intentional. And I certainly have some old Union prayer books in my library that simply have, there's a middle stage where it simply says Kol Nidre is recited, and it doesn't give you the words. But I think that the Yair in the paper noted in his conclusion, and I'll end with this myself, Kol Nidre sets the stage for the synagogue itself to become a stage, and through it the community produces itself. And I think that observation is what we see fulfilled in Elazar's study of one individual from one very specific congregation, that the community produces itself, and people find their way in and they find their way out. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Yair and Elazar, maybe you'd like to comment or respond somehow to Laura's response?
Well, first, I really want to thank Laura. I was just writing her in chat privately, but yes, I really want to thank her for this really insightful and generous response. I think there is something very, I'm taking a lot of things that I wish to think of more following this, but the question of dynamism and the tension between theory and practice, and the kind of the way that halachic authorities try to negotiate that, I think that was very much, I think this is a key for me to kind of try to make this more precise, because I find the halachic texts, I would say I approach these halachic texts at the first to say, okay, there is this Kol Nidre, which is something that, nobody really knows what's going on there. It's unclear. People are doing it. It's like, it always seems like a testimony to the strength of the people's practice, right? Because there is a sense in which it has no real source, and it's just people are just continuing doing it, and halakhic sources are kind of ambivalent. What I kind of learned, and I think what Laura said was really important for me in this sense, was the way that the halakhic texts themselves can be some kind of like a seismograph or some kind of litmus paper. How do you say that? To see what are what's happening within the ritual. They are not giving the meaning of it, but somehow the response to it is enable us to see the inner tensions or the inner working of the ritual, because it doesn't work well with theory and with halakhic theory. So the way you kind of formulated that was really helpful for me, and so thank you specifically for that, and for the whole response.
Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate it, the comprehensive response. And I would like to maybe to add something, because you mentioned the musical aspect and the power of the music. And you said something about the dynamic between it said something between the dynamic between the rabbi, the leader, and the people. And I would like to add something about resistance in the context of a musical aspect, because traditionally every Shabbat services in Keilat Alev, they use in a musical instrument. It's integral part of the Shabbat services. Instead of Yom Kippur, in Kol Nidre, only voices of people, no musical instruments. And that's the season really, I found it really fascinating, because according to the Reformed theology and liturgy, it's legal to use electricity or music in the prayer, and it's integral part of the liturgy to include and consider music. But the congregants and the rabbi decided that no, in Kol Nidre, no music, only your voices. And one of the congregants resist and oppose about this decision, because she explained and emphasized the power of the music in the spiritual moment of the performances, in the spiritual moments of Kol Nidre. But they decided, after all, to continue with the same decision, to continue with no music, no include a musical instrument. And it's interesting because the anomaly actually is the anomaly is don't use a musical instrument in the ritual. And in the Reform congregation, the anomaly is it's the consensus, but in this case, the consensus don't include a music instrument. It's the anomaly. I mean, I found it really, really funny how people think about the music and their voice as part of the ritual, the part of the performance, because it's not the performance. It's come back to Judith Butler. We are doing performance, so we are doing the music maybe without the instrument. So that's one point that I would like to add, and thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Music, yeah.
Right. Thank you all for the wonderful discussion. I'm wondering if Yair and Elazar, if there's a wonderful conversation happening in the chat, and if there's anything that you might want to comment from there. And from there, we could just open the floor to questions from those attending.
Well, there is, I will just perhaps the final question in the chat that I see, which is, why is prayer performance? Which, as I guess, is a really fundamental question we have to address here. We keep saying performance, and maybe this is not as clear as maybe this needs some clarification. And I would like to, perhaps my first response to this is what Laura said, which also kind of was mind-opening to me, the idea that we are halachically required to speak so that we may hear, this notion that we have to be our own audience. I find, I mean, the word performance is always ambivalent because it sometimes has this connotations of being a show, of being something which is just, done for spectacle. But I think here there is a real question, as Laura said, of for whom this is done, who is the person or the entity or the community that is the addressee of what we do. And I think especially in prayer, we can speak about every ritual as a performance, but I think specifically in prayer, which is supposed to be addressed to someone, the question of who this someone is very fundamental. And then the other question that kind of comes after that is, given that this is supposed to be conducted to an addressee, how do we address this addressee, and what do we have in our disposal in music, voice, body, space, materiality, words? How do we kind of, utilize all of this to communicate with this addressee? And I think what comes up, again, I think, thank you, Laura, for kind of highlighting this, because I think Kol Nidre is a very, very tricky situation regarding who the addressee is. And there's something very complicated or multi-layered, which allows for multiple addressees or maybe no addressees, and maybe I'm my own addressee. And I think there are all these various options, but they all come, I mean, I think this question is very much connected to the notion of prayer as performance, not necessarily as something which is just a show, but as something that kind of works with all the various elements we have to communicate with someone or something or ourselves. So this is my answer to this question.
Thank you, Yair. Elazar, would you like to comment on any comments in the chat?
I just want to add, when I say performance, I consider the participant as an agency. He is the participant are agents. They are not a passive player, they are active player. They are on the stage. So when I say performance, I'm not, and I try to imagine how, and I believe that prayer is like a theater. I mean, I can find some objects and some embodiment understanding and the connection and dynamic between individual and the cultural materialistic objects. So when I say performance, I think that I would like to place the individual in the center. And in this case, the theory come together with the field, because Reform Judaism locate and place the individual in the center of the religious system. I mean, God is there, the text is there, the authority is there, the rabbi is there, the community is there, but the individual, he is or she is in the center. So I think in this case, I can justify the choice of performance. It's not only a ritual or act or action.
Okay, thank you. I see that Alex Klein has his hand raised. So Alex, please, we invite you to ask your question.
Thank you, Mark. This is very fascinating to me and extremely interesting, because I understand all your points of view, but I think you're overcomplicating things. And by overcomplicating things, it becomes academic as opposed to prayer. And we can put academia into everything and blow it up out of all proportions and look for answers that may not even be there or shouldn't have to be there. When one goes into a synagogue, whether you're LGBT or Q or anything, and to any synagogue, it doesn't matter whether it's Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, every aspect of Judaism, you go for a certain purpose. You find a synagogue that you feel comfortable with, and then that becomes your synagogue because of your being comfortable. You are then able, because of your comfortableness, to pray, or to get, if you can't pray, to find that person who does it for you. And every time that person prays, unless he or she is reading notes and praying from notations or musical notes, then it's not from the heart, and then it is meaningless. When a chazan or a cantor, male or female from any shul, prays from the heart, it is different every time one prays within the confines of the nusach, which is appropriate to that prayer. And that is the important thing. The heart, the neshama, the devekus, that makes all the difference within our prayers. Without those, it's a cult and neshama, it's cold, it's meaningless. And no matter what instruments you bring or orchestrations or anything, that's all it is. Musical instruments playing something. The heart of the meaning. I have no objections to music, but being in shul, have a jam session and get the feeling of the music within those Reformed synagogues. That's fine. But anything that is confined within prayer is not an individual thing, and it doesn't work for me. So I find it very difficult today to find a synagogue in my town that I can relate to, that moves me, that makes my hairs on my arms stand up, or gives me that heartful feeling. So sometimes I'd rather stay at home and do my own thing, or listen to recordings that move me and implore me and elevate me. If I can't find a shul like that, I'd rather stay at home. And it's irrelevant to me, LGBT, all these terminologies and all these types of shul. If I walked into Reform shul tomorrow and that did something for me, I would go every week. And I'm an Orthodox person. So to me, it doesn't matter. It's a service that means everything. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Alex. Let's take another question from Leah.
In the whole question between what is performance, as a former opera singer, recovering Wagnerian soprano, I kind of take umbrage with the word performance. I've tried very hard to separate bima and stage. To what you said, Alex, about just reading it off the musical page. When the music has become one with you, it doesn't matter if it's a song, if it's an opera roll, if it's your liturgy. If it's reached that point of atzilut within you, where it's become a part of you, it's become part of your DNA, you can still have the music in front of you, but it's coming from a different place than if you were sight reading it. And I think what we're trying to say here is, how do we balance keva and kavanah? And that's always tricky. I'm conscious, very conscious of the fact that I can't bring my Wagner voice onto the bima. I don't care how big the place is. It has to be a completely different sound. And I want people, especially in Kol Nidre, especially there, I want them to feel moved to sing with me. I tell them at the very beginning, I don't want to daven at you, I want to daven with you. And so I try to put it in an area, I'm not thinking in English, good grief, Tonlage, it's terrible, I can't think of the word in English, in a pitch where where people are able to sing along. Even if it's a little uncomfortable for me, I'd rather have people be able to sing along and to feel picked up, to feel included. I think that's the whole point of Kol Nidre, to include people, not to perform to them.
Thank you, Leah. It really raises a. Sorry, I have to. Really, hold on one second, Boaz. We'll get to you, Boaz. We'll get to you. Please be patient. I think it raises a really important question about what do we mean by performance in a liturgical context. One of the cantors I taught with at Hebrew Union College in the School of Sacred Music said, the key to be a good cantor is for your congregation to never catch you singing. So yes, yeah.
So if I may respond to this, because I think this is a very good point, and thank you, Leah, for saying this, because I think this is perhaps the question of what kind of connotations the word performance comes with. Because for me, when you say, I want to include, the congregation, I want them to sing with me, and therefore I would sing perhaps in a lower pitch, then for me, this means this is a performance, which is a different kind of performance than the one that you're doing on an opera stage. And you actually are very conscious of how you utilize your voice in a way that will kind of elicit a specific response from this kind of audience. So for me, again, when I'm speaking of performance here, I try to kind of neutralize the connotations of a show and of kind of extra, because I think this is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how we actually we work with the various aspects of what performance has, which includes voice and body, etc., to elicit a specific response. So my answer to you, in a sense, is saying this: it doesn't mean that as an opera singer you perform, as an cantor you do not perform, but actually you perform in both cases, but very differently. And this is actually a great example of how a performance of liturgy is different than a performance of opera, but it doesn't mean that one of them is not performance. I hope I'm clear in this.
Thank you. And we'll go next question to Boaz.
I had a few comments, but I had to say something about this performance thing, because we've been spending 20 minutes on a subject that we should say goodbye to that topic. It's overly chewed, and this is an academic environment, and so we know that everything that we discussed is in fact a performance. Let's just not worry about it, and let's not get into the not subtleties actually of the difference in what in academia we call performance, and in performance studies and performance theory, and also the congregational different use of that word. And I think it's so chewed on. It's so we don't even need to discuss it in academia. We know what performance is more or less, and what the subject that you're talking about. Actually, the word performance happens to be attached to it, but it's a whole different other use of the word. So that's just a waste of time. No, it is a waste of time. But anyway, regarding Elazar's paper, I will eventually phrase it as a question, but what I heard was things that I hear a lot in everything that's gender studies or gay studies, or all those things are applied to, and it was primarily a review. In other words, there are all sorts of very important points that you can actually get into this, and they're not necessarily LGBT. And for just one, I mean, the example that you gave of Kol Nidre in the Reform is one of a big phenomenon of the fact that once alternative texts are offered, in this particular case, as wonderful as it may be, it's no longer Kol Nidre. I mean, Kol Nidre has several defining traits without which it's no longer what it is. That's fine, but it's a comment that's worth exploring, except instead of just showing it. When you said about the Talmud actually is a closed system. It's not an open system. What you're referring to is the halachic process. The halachic process is an open process, and it's not complete either. But it's and that concerns gay studies in a way, because the point is that the halachic process can actually justify or not justify more or less any subject you want. But the reality is, for example, I mean, the conservative halachic process could actually within halacha say that it's okay to drag the synagogue. But what's interesting is that no matter which denomination, there's some issues, and that's not a halachic issue, it's a cultural issue. No matter how halachically you want to turn things around, nobody will allow you to eat pork. And nobody will allow you to, and that's what the trembling before God, it was very moving, the cinema film because the guy there was an Orthodox guy, and he desperately wanted an Orthodox rabbi to give him permission halachically to be gay, and he was not going to get it, and he will not get it, not because it's a halachic topic, because it's a cultural topic. So my question to you, in the whole, after all that, there are other things, is in your paper, what is actually specific to Kol Nidre in what you said, and perhaps also, like, what else does it have to say about this topic as opposed to just reporting it?
Thank you, Boaz. Elazar?
Yeah, thank you so much, Boaz. You're right. I mean, some people say, I mean, some congregants, when I talk about them with, during my fieldwork, explain maybe the same explanation regarding the connection to their sexual or gender identity by practicing different traditional or holidays practices. I've already published one paper about Shema Yisrael, and some people describe same meaning by Shema Yisrael. But what I try to do is to say that specifically Yom Kippurim, specifically Kol Nidre, and the meaning of what does it mean to feel other, to feel your body differently compared to other holidays practices. I think that the description is different compared to other regular or Shabbat services or different, I don't know, religious gestures. But yeah, there is a common experience between all these kind of experiences when we think about how LGBTQ people experience the moment of religious practices. Regarding Alex Klein, yeah, prayer is autonomy of conflict, and there is a tension between the written text and the oral text. And I think that's why I try to think and to explore the ritual by using performance theories, because the tensions and because the conflicts. And we consider there is a purpose. I mean, people come with a purpose, but instead of to think about which kind of purpose and to look for a clear purpose, I try to think about, or to invite us to think, why do we need a purpose? I mean, some people don't come with a clear purpose. Maybe they come just to spend their time on, to feel solidarity with other people, or to resist against the huge ideology, the Orthodox monopoly in Israel. And there is no spiritual purpose, and there is no magical or religious attention or passion. Just one more reason to feel comfortable with the moment. And maybe there is one more. This is the tension between sociology and I don't know, sociology and phenomenologic theories or other disciplines. But I don't know. I use Leibovich to think, instead of to look for a purpose, just to think, well, what does it mean, a purpose, among people that sometimes feel or deal with the legitimation. You don't have a purpose. You are not regular people in the society. You are out of the social order. Look your purpose, justify your purpose, and then come to give your purpose in a community. So I don't know. I just think about it when we talk about purpose, and it's really important comment. I mean, the tension between written text and oral text, and the spontaneous moments or the simultaneously moments in the prayer.
Thank you, Elazar. And I just want to direct maybe one final quick question. Hopefully you can come in quickly. Mark Slobin had asked what the music that was presented in this Kol Nidre context, and if it was the same or any different, just what is the music there?
Elazar?
I didn't expect to be addressed. What
Yeah.
did you say about the music?
No, it was addressed to
Ask me
Elazar.
yeah, my dog is it's crazy here, so I couldn't hear if you asked me something. Sorry.
Oh, just what was the music in the Kol Nidre context
that
you were looking at?
yeah, I was just wondering what
Big.
music in your-
I'm sorry, but if you can repeat.
Just simply, what was the music in the context that you were?
in the congregation
So
background?
in general, in Reform congregation, it's I said the Reform congregation, but there is no de. I mean, in different congregation in Israel, people use in different songs and different.
No, I think that the question was directed specifically to the gay, to the LGBT synagogue that you were looking at.
Regarding the question which I found on chat, some prayers are the traditional prayers like Lecha Dodi or Did Nefesh and other our familiar songs, but some songs are different, and some songs come by the queer canon. I mean, you can find Dana International, for example, in the Siddur, or I don't know, Christina Aguilera, Beautiful of Christina Aguilera in the Siddur. And
so I'm sorry, Elazar, I just meant this really quick question. In this LGBTQ synagogue, what is the Kol Nidre that they use?
What is the
Kol Nidre?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
The text that's recited of Kol Nidre, what melody do they use for that text of Kol Nidre?
They use in the Havodah Shebalev, the Reform Israeli Siddur.
And the melody that they use?
Wow, every year it's different. I mean, in Halev congregation, one of a scholar from Hebrew Union College come and pray with the rabbi and conveyed and sang with different versions, and there is not only one version. I mean, every year different.
All right, thank you. So our big thanks to our presenters, Yair Lipshitz and Elazar Ben-Lulu, and our wonderful respondent, Laura Lieber. Thank you so much for your contributions today. Very thought-provoking. I'm sorry that we don't have more time for more discussion, but Ruthie Abelovich and I thank you so much for your preparations and presentation. And we invite everyone to join us for the next presentation, which will feature Ruth Cohen and Amanda Miriam Haya Siegel, as well as Mark Slobin. And we call upon Ruth Cohen to give us a preview as to what we'll see in our next session. Oh, you need to unmute.
Okay, so first of all, I must share with you my experience of this particular evening. People were asking about the heterophony, and there was something very heterophonic about the experience tonight, because while I was listening to what was going on, I had to refer all the time to things that were on the backside with the chats. And so it was a feeling of all sorts of voices, noises coming in and out, and it was very interesting as such. One has to think about it in terms of what is it that we got through this kind of multivocal listening or hearing and participating. So anyway, we are dealing with community, and tonight the notion of community was very conspicuous, and my own topic would be vocal communities in the twilight, Kol Nidre before total darkness. And of course, vocal communities is a universal phenomenon. But what I want to argue is that something happened during the 19th century that made vocal communities something much more vital, in the sense that people could congregate through through the voices in a more meaningful way than beforehand, because that was more or less almost the only way that they could cohere and become a community, as compared to previous generations, when community Gemeinschaft were more the way that people organize themselves as community, as societies. So what I would like to argue is that as we approach the twilight of Jewish existence in Europe, we can see both in literary and the cinematic reflections of it. Part of it was done in the United States. Is that this vocal community becomes around Kol Nidre even more urgent, more important in terms of the inclusion and exclusion of the individual, including the cantor themselves. So that's more or less. Thank you.
Thank you. We look forward to the final session. Invite all of you to join us. And with that, we wish you well. Have a very good evening, or depending where you are, the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Very
Thanks.
interesting.
תודה רבה. Thank you so much.